Well, welcome everybody, welcome. And hopefully we'll keep this so that you stay awake after lunch, because it's always challenging right after you ate. Just a quick non-poll question, because this is kind of can become technical. How many of you out there are electrical-based professionals? Great. So I am your friend, because the ones that are not electrical-based, I will make sure that my team doesn't just kick you down into the weeds and lose you. So, what I love about SAMI events is that no matter what presentation you go to and no matter what your business is, you find something out of that presentation that applies. So we're going to talk about energy resilience and security from microgrids and actually doing the project scoping and the planning, the 1391 planning. We're going to use examples from microgrid projects and resilience projects. But what I want you to walk away with is an understanding of how important it is for us to do planning for cost, for the size of the facilities and the requirements of the facility. That's what I want you to walk away with today. So I am Bill Beal. I'm going to be the moderator today. Some fun facts about me. I'm foolish enough to run marathons and have done 7 Ironman events. And I will tell you that I never woke up one day and went, oh, I want to be an Ironman. One day I found out I was stupid enough to do that. But it's a fun thing, a fun fact. Those of you that have not scanned a code yet, does anybody need this code? Okay, we're going to do some polling questions in a moment, so I'm going to let you pull that open. You should get a link there, and then when you get that, it'll say, find your session. Yeah, if you go search for session, and I'm going to suggest you put in 1391 or ERCIP, ERCIP. That should find our session pretty quickly. And I'm going to give a few moments. We are not rushed through this. This is the challenging part. This is the dad in me. Wants to come show you each how to do this, right? And each of you are like, hey, I'm an adult. I don't need your help. Anybody else still need the code? Still good? Okay. So if you find the session, I suggest you search for 1391 for DD1391 or ERCIP, ERCIP, Energy Resilience. A couple of housekeeping notes for all of us. We got 2 exits here. The exits to the outside are to the right where we came from most likely. If you have a mobile phone, which I'm hoping you do so you can be a part of the poll, please put that into silence mode. I chuckled. I heard there was a presenter that forgot to silence his. The audio recordings for this will be available to all attendees until August 30th. And all of us got scanned as we came into the room, so that will allow you to claim your professional development hours at the end before August 30th. I want to thank our sponsors. We couldn't do this without them sponsoring and their help to us. So thank you to them. So I want to introduce our speakers. Larry Amala is with Black & Veatch. He's a professional engineer. He's a project manager, a PMP professional. Larry has been with Black & Veatch for 48 years. I said, Larry, are you going to make it to 50? He said, nope. And he made the joke, does anyone here know how to use a mimeograph machine? I know what it is, but I certainly don't know how to use it. And then Larry has 2 grand dogs that his kids left with him as they departed or came and went. So he's got 2 fantastic dogs that he takes care of. Kevin Miller is a licensed professional electrical engineer with Black & Veatch Engineering. He has his lead credentials. Kevin's fun fact, well, first of all, he's a K-State grad, so am I, so I'll allow him this, a big Wildcat fan. Kevin hiked the Inca Trail in Machu Picchu, and I asked him, I said, so Kevin, did you train for that? He's like, no, that's what made it so much work.
It was not a vacation.
He said it's not a vacation. So, yes, good. Our first poll question, we got 27 seconds. Should be active on your phone if you've got that still open. And hopefully these are, oh, I got to get mine. So, how are we doing for responses there? All right, we're doing great. I was told that 30 seconds is a very long time. And I'm going to tell you guys, there's a trick here. There's at least 2 right answers. So don't freak out here. Okay, so I'm going to say that for MilCon, DD1391s, that's a congressional authorization. So Congress can provide a reprogramming change. And USACE headquarters can also do that, which I was kind of surprised, but depending upon the amount and quantity, USACE headquarters can as well. Let's go to our next polling question. There we go. So what types of microgrid projects have you executed? There's no right answer to this. And we're using this for data collection for later, so be honest. How we doing? Got 8 seconds. Lots of good answers. This kind of tells us a little bit about the audience. So look at that. We've got some people that have not and are here about planning, and then we've got several others that have actually implemented projects or worked on them. So that's a good cross-reference or diverse group. We have one last polling question. And I will tell you, read it carefully, it's somewhat of a trick question. And the question is, does the DD1391 affect the design fee or the overall fee or just FAR limitations? The point of this is, I'll wait. I'm not going to vote. So I think many times that we as either the contractors or the government, we forget that the 1391, although it's planning, it definitely affects the construction cost and all those things, but it also has an impact on your design fee, your FAR limitations. So as the government, you should be interested in making sure that the 1391 is as accurate as it can be, because that affects the amount of service or help that you get in designing that, not just the construction. So there's a little nuance there that I wanted you guys to be aware of as we went through this. So listen, we're going to try and make this fun, and we're going to try and make this timely. I'm going to hand this off to Larry Amala to speak to us.
Thank you, Bill. Okay. How many people know what a 1391 is? Good. We all know. Okay, I'm going to build a little bit on, if you were at the general session this morning, Rear Admiral Vanderlei stated that we need to do better on our planning, if you're at that session. And this is going to build on that because we agree. We need to do better. Okay, the 1391 is, I call, the Bible. This defines the project. Now, when you get this, it tells you, this is going to justify the program to Congress. This document provides the funding and project components. We need to get it right. But sometimes we have a bad decision. Best available data. Okay, guys? Sometimes the DD 1391 is wrong at the time you're going to start using it. But it wasn't wrong at the time they did it. This is the information they had, and this is what they did. So this is not criticizing the DD 1391 process at the time they did it, but we can improve on it so we don't have a bad decision. Okay. What does the document do? It provides the cost limitations. We all know that. But it also provides limitations on the facilities. If we're doing a microgrid, it tells you how much generation capacity you're going to install. It tells you what your battery energy storage system size you're going to install. defines critical facilities. It may or may not identify utility modifications. And on this one, not so much, but it tells you your building square footage limitations. Okay, this is the DD1391. It's just a form. This is a standard form. It shows you, what the cost of the facilities are, but you notice the line items doesn't provide a lot of detail at the top. Below it tells you the scope description, but I've seen 1391s that show very little scope descriptions, and I have ones that have a lot. It varies, but it's very, very important because this defines the project. Okay, the issues. Scope of work definition. Does the document accurately define all project elements? Have you got ones where you know what the scope of work is now and you look at DD 1391 and it doesn't have all that scope in it? How many people? Raise hands. Okay. Is the cost estimate complete? That usually goes with the first one. If you don't have the full scope, you don't have the cost estimate complete. Okay, everybody knows what supply chain issues we've hit now. Okay? Has it taken that into account? Because that affects your construction period. I had one job where it said we constructed in 1 year. You can't get the equipment in 1 year. You could have gotten it 4 years ago when they did the DD 1391. You can't get it now. Okay, that changes. That means if you have a long construction period, you have more escalation. Okay? And the age of DD 1391, that is again on the recent escalation. Escalation has gone through the roof. That affects your cost. You have a problem. Okay, scope of services. For a microgrid, it will tell you what size generation you're going to have there. It will tell you the fuel type very often. Natural gas, diesel. Solar, it'll tell you if the solar is on site, if it's off site, how much solar you're putting in. These are things that you cannot change on the project. That's what it's been defined as. Okay, the BESS, which is the battery energy storage system, the size and number of BESSes. This is the Bible. It's telling you what your project parameters are. You need to get this right. Okay, what facilities are included? What are critical facilities? What aren't critical facilities? It's a facility-based or a feeder-based. Big difference. One of the issues we hit here, if you are doing feeder-based, you have 2 megawatts of critical facilities on that feeder. You may have 2 megawatts of uncritical facilities, and your power generation has to cover both. But did they do that when they did the 1391? Okay. Distribution system. Who owns it? Is it government? Is it a privatized utility? Is it a grid supplier? You're going to have to negotiate with all parties, depending on how this thing is set up. And existing generation assets. Very often you're going to take some existing generation assets and add it to your system. Last one you'll see a lot of times. What is the contractual arrangement between the utilities and the government? What does their contract say? Who owns the contract? Because very often we get on the base and you have the base, and you may have the DLA who actually has a contract with the private utility contract, Defense Logistics Agency. So you have another agency you have to deal with. So as you go through this, you have to understand how you're going to do the project, and hopefully the DD 1391 is defined this properly. Okay, we're going to go to the best practices, and I'm going to turn this over to Kevin.
All right, thanks, Larry. So some best practices for the 1391. We always want to allow for additional time for program validation, not only during preliminary design, but at the planning charrette stages very, very early. We want to identify goals of the project. So I know we have a mix of people here in the audience, but a lot of times us as the A&E will go into the charrette stage after we received our 1391, and we're talking to the energy managers, the DPW folks, the end users of the project, and a lot of their requirements may not be captured in that 1391. And that's where we get into reprogramming and how do we get all the needs of the mission or the end users captured. We need to identify existing generation sources on-site and off-site. Are there generators existing on the buildings that we need to incorporate into our design or our microgrid? Are there other generation assets outside utility-owned solar PV or large-scale generation renewable sources? Generation alternatives is a requirement of 1391 for renewable energy, for battery energy storage, for some sort of new technology that we need to incorporate. And then again, critical facilities and then the non-critical and critical loads. What are the facilities or the loads that we need to capture for the mission for this microgrid resilience project to maintain that mission or maintain the capabilities that need to be met? And then on top of that, the system load data. Are these individual facilities that need to be powered? Are there multiple loads within the facility that we need to capture? Maybe not the whole thing. So it starts at the planning stages, the charrette stages, the early design stages. We're going to identify these and nail down those requirements that we have. We want to do load studies and optimize those generation requirements. And on the next slide, we'll show you some graphic details on how we do that, where we work with the end users and the customer to make sure that we're identifying what those loads are that need to be captured and how we can do that within the scope of the 1391, or if we need to work on reprogramming or capturing that inside that requirements. And then, as Larry mentioned too, the contractual arrangements between the stakeholders. A lot of times when we're working on microgrids and there's privatized utilities involved inside the installation, there's the privatized utilities outside with the utility company or the utility provider. What are those arrangements with the DLA or with the utility provider? And how can we get all the stakeholders involved and under agreement so that everyone's understanding of what our requirements are? One thing that we always do at every project is we go through a generation technology evaluation. We like to assess at each site or each project what's available, what's applicable. When you look at renewable energy, sometimes geothermal is better in certain locations, sometimes solar energy is better in certain locations, sometimes the availability of natural gas, or if you're in an island setting or remote, maybe diesel is the best option. If you're doing stuff overseas, maybe you have different other requirements with different utility providers or energy sources that you have to be aware of. But it's not a one-size-fits-all. We have to do this every site as an evaluation that helps us define and verify those requirements within the DD1391. So why does load matter? Again, this is what when we're talking about microgrids or resilience energy projects, this is what we're trying to identify so that we can support and make sure that the requirements for the generation needed meets the intent of the mission of the end user. A lot of different aspects go into this. We have does it need to be 24/7 mission capable? Is there any outages that can happen? What are the economics of that? And, any load shedding that can be done or load shedding requirements that all go into what we look at. So some quick examples. This is just a generic project where we have uncovered peak loads with a 2 megawatt engine generator. So the lines here show if you just have 2 megawatts of generator, here's the loads that you're not going to capture if you're running that generator full time. Now, if you take that same generator and add 100% solar PV, so a battery energy storage or some sort of captured energy, you see those lines go down and you're able to capture that base load almost completely. So now if you do the same thing, 2 megawatt engine, but now you only have 25% solar PV, you're not capturing everything. You have those nighttime periods or cloudy periods where you're still missing some of those loads that need to be captured. And then, but if you're able to load shed and reduce some of those peak loads by even 5%, without solar PV, you're still able to capture, again, a lot more load than you were beginning just with just a generator. And then the last two here, at the bottom right slide there is with load shedding and 25% solar, you're almost fully captured. And then on the left side, you are reducing your engine capacity, increasing your solar PV at 25%, and then you have a 50% load reduction. So these are the kind of exercises we go through with our customers to identify where can we shed load, what load is required, how can we, what are requirements for base load generation, for renewable energy, solar PV, BESS, how all that works together to make sure that we're capturing the best load that we can to meet the mission requirements. As Larry mentioned earlier, I think Rear Admiral set us up pretty good for this discussion today. We want to make sure that we use the planning stages as best we can to verify project requirements and cost estimate. I know from experience, a lot of times when we receive our scopes of work, our DD1391s, then we talk to the end users and customers, there's a change in command or change in personnel, or the mission requirements have changed. And we want to make sure that from the PCR through the charrette, through the design phase, that we're capturing all the requirements, whether they change or not. During our proposal stage, when we're working on our proposal with the Corps of Engineers or our other stakeholders, our customer, we're verifying the scope of work that we have with the 1391, that's the project requirements, that's the CCL, looking at our marking conditions, looking at construction lead times maybe for that location. Remote places like Alaska or Guam may be different than here in Florida or Kansas where we're from as far as availability of contractors and construction time. And then we also look at additional time for program validation during the preliminary design. So that's making sure, even though there's a planning charrette, we go through our proposal stage, that we account for our design schedule the charrette with the end users, with the customers, review of that charrette, review of the 35% design, and continuing that validation and scope of the 1391 throughout the design of the project. And then we also, as Larry mentioned, continue looking at the equipment lead times and supply chain issues. We at Black & Veatch get quarterly reports from industry that show updated lead times on major equipment, transformers, generators, large-scale cable, and that helps build us a accurate construction estimate and cost schedule to give to our customers as the design progresses, as it seems to be that sometimes things are leveling out, maybe they're going up, maybe they're going down, but we want to make sure that when we know that we can plan the best we can when the 1391 says, here's the start of construction, here's what we estimate that we think it's going to be. So, some project examples. So one project here, we're working on a microgrid in Zoetendaal, Belgium. It's a design bid build project. So the original scope for the 1391 that we got was a solar PV with battery energy storage. Throughout the concept design, we determined that just the solar PV and the battery energy storage would not allow for the full capture of the critical load that they had. So we did some different iterations of a power study and determined that the installation will need a backup generator or roll-up generator to connect to this in order to capture that load. Now, that generator was not originally included in the 1391, so we were able to have that as a backup connection that allow the customer to roll that in, so when they have these peaks in load, they can include that and get the full capabilities of the microgrid. The different modes of operation, we have island mode, where we can capture that critical load within the island. And then the grid-connected mode, so the solar PV and the battery energy storage can produce that renewable energy back into the grid and serve all of the buildings during normal operation. So as I mentioned, some of the studies that we did to complete this, we did the feasibility analysis. So this allows us to verify the scope of the 1391 meets the project needs, and we include everything that's required. We do an energy economic analysis, so this guides the selection of the major equipment, making sure that the generators, the solar PV, the battery energy storage are all properly sized and will fit the needs of the project. Our power system analysis, so we do multiple iterations using power system applications to determine that the solar PV, the battery, the generators, they all work as needed to get the different loads. We did different iterations that showed our customers without the generator, you're only going to capture 40%. With the generator, you can get 100. If you have a larger scale generator, you're going to use less solar, less battery, things of that nature. And then we do a life cycle cost analysis that shows the customer that with the front end purchase, here's your potential return on investment and what we can expect to see using that solar PV and that battery during normal operation to get some buyback, if you will, or some not using as much utility energy. So during this process, we look at the discipline design criteria. We compare the UFC codes with the host nation criteria. There's existing projects at the facility that integrate to what we're doing. So we need to make sure that those are coordinated and will work together when everything is said and done and built. We have a lot of permitting requirements that we have to capture, being host nation there in Belgium, as well as the requirements that USACE and our customer have, cybersecurity impacts, and then the cost estimating criteria, looking at escalation rate of materials, definitely varies over there versus what we're seeing here in the States, construction schedule, supply chain issues, and all of that in the end gets into the 1391 development. And so as part of this project, we looked at all this in the concept design phase, and we put this into a full package that we presented to our customers so they could capture this 1391 for additional funding and eventual construction. And some additional items we did here in the field study. So we did some UXO survey, some geotech, some topographic, and we try to do, we do all of these in the beginning because we want to make sure that there's nothing unknown, there's nothing going to show up later on once you get to construction. So especially over there in Europe, UXO is a big deal. We want to make sure that we get that mitigated early in the project. It gets captured in that cost estimate, not only for construction to mitigate that, but also on the design side so we can get folks out there to do surveys and make sure everything gets taken care of. Okay. The next project I'll discuss here, Fort Bliss. So we have a scope for 100% design bid build for 4 separate sites at Fort Bliss, Texas. The original 1391 that we received had, one of the sites had solar PV and battery energy storage included, and 3 of them did not, just natural gas generation. There's a privatized utility provider there at Fort Bliss that we are working with, not only inside the installation, but the utility provider providing energy into it. There's additional site improvements that are required, SCADA and controls, and the estimated CCL for this project for all 4 sites originally was about $35 million. So some issues we ran into, the 1391s were outdated. A lot of those were completed 2020, 2021, as Larry mentioned, and before we have a lot of escalation rates in the equipment, a lot of delays in lead time for some of that equipment. And then we also had the scope of work that we got was to validate and include solar PV and battery energy storage that wasn't originally in those 1391s. So the 1391s with that cost estimate, we worked with our customer to understand that what we're going to provide you is going to be a lot higher than what's in that original 1391, and we need to be ready for that and work through that as far as the funding process. So as part of this, our program validation with the 1391, we looked at the generation for the natural gas. You see here the 0 for the PV and the BESS, about $35 million. Once we did our scope of work and looked at the overall escalation rates and cost of that equipment, we ended up with about $88.3 million, so a swing of $50 million. So quite a lot, and almost double of what our original cost was. So our resolution is we provided this ROM cost in our proposal, so our customer knew right away what we were expecting the CCL to be. And we included that in the overall programmatic budget. So with the FAR that we mentioned earlier, so making sure that we're getting our design fee and that they're aware of what we're going to be charging, but also getting up front that your CCL at the end of the day and the funding that you're going to need is going to be a lot higher than originally planned. And again, best practice, you want to validate the DD1391s at the start of the project, ensure that all requirements are met and included, and then the issues with the reprogramming, some of this took 3 months delay. You just got to make sure you build that into the design schedule and where that ends up being inside of the construction schedule with where you're at. So I'll turn this back over to Larry. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Okay, this is another, I have 2 more projects we'll go through. This one is at Fort Stewart, Georgia. It was 100% design bid build. 10 megawatts new generation natural gas. We had an existing 1.5 megawatt microgrid on it, and we had 30 megawatts of photovoltaic off-site. This photovoltaic was under the grid supplier Georgia Power's control. They were given land by the government to build this on it. They built the 30 megawatts, but they had no direct connection from this PEV field to the base. We have a privatized utility provider, not the grid provider, a separate one. We had to do site improvements. We had to tie into the existing privatized utility, and it was estimated at $21.5 million. Okay, DD1391 was overcome events. This was prepared pre-COVID. There was cost increases to the high escalation and supply chain issues. The project was estimated to be constructed in 1 year. I can't get the generators in 1 year. So we were looking at over 2 years. That adds more escalation to it. Okay, the project could not be constructed for the CCL. Right off the bat, we realized this. This is going to have schedule delays. Nobody likes that. We were all adults in the room. We understood what had happened. You know, the user understood what had happened. The Corps understood what was happening. This is a classical bad decision. Best available data. The DD1391, at the time they did it, was fine. It isn't now. But we're adults in the room. So we got together and we said, okay, let's develop the cost, let's develop the scope, let's develop the schedule, and put together a memorandum that we could send upstairs and get this reprogrammed early. This was done during the 35%. We did this. It was presented. We had the support of the new construction estimate. We developed a memorandum for the program costs. We developed a memorandum for the schedule, and the Corps applied for and received the program change based on justifications. It did slow us up a little bit, but not as much as some other ones. But again, understand there's a problem, don't ignore it. Let's move forward and get it done. And they did. Best practice. Make sure the DD1391 is reviewed and updated to meet current conditions. Do that early and make sure that it is correct. You don't want to come in later on a 35 or 65% design submittal and you know you can't do it. Okay, validate cost factors. Escalation, equipment costs, lead times, and construction schedule before and throughout the project. It's also helpful if you do this before the DD1391. But this was a case that they didn't mess up the size of the generation. They didn't mess up any of that. It just took a while to actually get the project going and escalation supply chain issues hit. Fort Benning. Okay. One of the things we talked about was the list of critical facilities. This was not clearly defined in the 1391 and the preparation and planning stages. Generation capacity was not coordinated with critical loads because they didn't take into account the non-critical loads. Okay, the scope of the critical facilities kept changing. This added up to a little over 2 months worth of delay in the project. It required multiple iterations to get we were trying to maximize how many critical facilities we could do. It took us a lot of time. Okay, exactly what happened? The DD1391 said 20 critical facilities. When we got the scope of work, it said 30 critical facilities. During the development of the design, they came back with 540 facilities, of which 20 were considered significant. 200 is considered significant. That was a bit of a problem. So what we had to do was we developed a detailed GSI modeling and analysis to map where the critical facilities were on the feeders. They didn't have that.
Larry, not everyone's electrical. Give them an example of what's on a feeder or how that works.
Okay, a feeder is basically you have multiple main lines that are coming out of a substation. This main line supplies different facilities on it. So you may have a feeder that has 10 facilities on it. 5 may be critical. 5 may not be critical. You can drop the loads on the non-critical, except you have no way to do it. So you have to cover the loads. An example, like you have 2 megawatts worth of critical power, you have 2 megawatts worth of non-critical power. That feeder has to be able to carry 4 megawatts of power. You have to supply 4 megawatts of power to that feeder to get to critical facilities, even though you have 2 megawatts of critical facilities. We had to identify the non-critical and critical facilities on it. We had to optimize the critical facilities. What can we power with the generation that is in the DD1391? We only had 10 megawatts. That's all we had. Okay, we also had some PV, but you can't carry everything with the PV because it's not 100% of the time. What we did is we came up with, I don't know how many scenarios, I forget, there was a large number, and we gave it to the government with our recommendation of what to do. It went to the base commander to make the final decision. That's where it goes to. Somebody has to say thumbs up, thumbs down. Okay, best practices. Identify intent and goals of the project. What are you trying to do? Are you feeder-based? Are you doing mission critical? Are you covering everything? What are you trying to do and how are you trying to do it? And identify load requirements early in design, critical facility distribution requirements. As Kevin showed, if we could have done load shedding, we could have used a different generation. Different combinations would cover more of the peak load. That is the things we were doing during the 35% in the base. It would be better if you do that during a planning charrette and do that earlier so that you define your 1391 and make sure your load requirements and your generations match before we start design. Again, as the Rear Admiral said this morning, we need to plan better, which means we got to take the time to plan better. It takes time, it takes money, it pays off at the end. Your schedules don't get disrupted. You don't have to redo DD1391s. On the Fort Stewart one, the planning wouldn't have changed anything. Things changed, okay? But being adults in the room, we did reprogramming and we got it moving. The second one, well, this took a lot longer because we had to go back and figure out what the critical facilities were and everything else. Could have been done earlier. Okay, thank you. And we're going to talk about questions and answers.
So what I find interesting is we had a lot of the same best practices, but as you go through and you listen about plan your DD 1391, one of the big things for those of you that are going to be defining an energy project is you got a couple challenges coming. One is the electrification memo, where you're going to be competing with generation and loads on the facility. So think ahead to that. The other thing that we didn't talk about, just simply from a time constraint standpoint, is documentation of electrical systems on our federal facilities is challenged at best. And so as much information and data you can get on that facility to plan in advance is the best. And don't count on all that equipment that's already there being useful. Some of it's gone through its useful life, and there's going to have to be some budget to support bringing in these new microgrid systems. So with that, a little bit of time, if you had that app open on here, please fill out the survey, evaluate this session. We would appreciate it. At this time, I'd like to open it up for questions. And if you guys can go to the mic with a question, that would be fabulous so I don't have to repeat it. And thank you.
Sure, I appreciate it. I'm Dan Pekovic, Lockheed Martin. I guess one of the things I was curious about going through the ERCIPs and reading them is it seems that the battery storage devices are always listed as cost per kilowatt as opposed to per kilowatt hour. Now I was wondering if that was like intentional, or if wouldn't it make more sense to offer more flexibility if you cost it per kilowatt hour, and then facilities aren't limited to that 2 to 4 hour lithium-ion product and can look at other options.
Lately, we've been seeing the definition is, say, 2 megawatts and 2 megawatt hours. Mm-hmm. So they've been providing both. But it goes back to the same thing. Was it load analysis done to determine was that the right size beforehand?
Okay, I appreciate it, because that's also what I'm trying to understand too, is at what point is that analysis like done and completed, and at what point can facilities?
And so here's what I'm going to suggest is if you're thinking of best practices and you're the government entity, you absolutely want to use some type of planning charrette or some type of planning that takes that into account. And then as Larry said, even if you do that, we have technology that improves and we have requirements that expand. And sometimes you have to reprogram based on those needs. But as you said, the best practice is to define that early. Thank you, sir.
And I'll build on that. I think part of that is the limitations of the 1391. The primary facilities right now, you can only list in KW or megawatts, so they usually just list that main size. And so part of the planning we do is making sure that that size, one, meets that base load as best as it can. And then in the description portion, if it's been planned properly, that's said we'll get into here's how many hours we think we need, but we'll validate that in our planning and our charrette to make sure that, is it 2 megawatts, 2 hour, like 2 megawatt hours, 2 megawatts, 4 megawatt hours, what do we need on ride through or capacity based on the load profile demand, or requirements of the installation. And some of that too is based on available site. If they give us a certain area and we have that 100-foot setback per the UFC, maybe we can only fit a smaller unit, because even though it's a 2 megawatt, once you double that capacity, you're adding another container or another battery onto that. So there's a lot of other limitations involved with that too, but I think part of that, in at least the primary facilities, is just the way that they can list it just as the kilowatt versus the kilowatt hour with it.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
I think we have a question at the back first.
Yes, I'm Antonio from NAVFAC Southeast. My question is about the cybersecurity requirement, and the UFC requirement, 410.6 requirement, and what effect has the establishing the CIA prior to 35% been on you guys as far as keeping that? Because I didn't see it in a best practice, and it's being missed all over, everywhere. So the cybersecurity requirement, what effect has that been on you guys?
No, very, very good question. It has a very big effect. Ideally, if that's listed in the 1391 from the beginning, those CIA ratings, that really helps us and the customer identify what we think the cost would be, because there's a cybersecurity cost in that for after construction, so they can do all the proper ATOs or point things. We mentioned here with the privatized utility aspect, that gets into another can of worms, because some of these microgrids are going to be conveyed to these privatized utilities, and now that follows the privatized utility cybersecurity requirements, maybe not the UFC or what that installation has in place, but then the installation maybe wants to connect to smart meters or some sort of connection aspect back to their energy management system. So now we have two separate cybersecurity requirements and two separate networks that are happening. So every site's a little bit different, but it's definitely at the forefront of every project, and we're making sure that in this development for 1391, one, that cost is captured as a line item at minimum, and two, that during the design phase, we're getting the AOs and SOs and everybody involved very early in the process, so we can identify these and make sure that no one's going to be surprised at the end once construction happens and they have to do all the cybersecurity aspects.
Okay, thanks. I work with a couple ERCIPs, and the problem has been not establishing a proper CIA in the right time.
Right.
So when you mentioned, you have it at the DD1391, that's surprising, because most times it's not captured until after 65%. So, that's a good best practice to have your CIA or notional CIA developed prior.
No, I agreed, yep.
Personally at the charrette. So you can capture that money and then make it a minimum moderate and not low, so you don't have to, and cost, make that money.
For those of you that aren't knowledgeable, the CIA level defines the cybersecurity requirement limits and can have a dramatic effect on cost and capability, and it takes time to get approval of those. And so, sir, excellent question.
Yeah, it's the hardness, and like I said, just in a perfect world, like you said, we would have this identified at the planning charrette stages before the 1391 gets written. It gets put into the 1391, and then you continue to validate that at the charrette, at the 35, as long as systems haven't changed, system owners haven't changed, requirements haven't changed. But yeah, the earlier the better, because that, with being as robust as it is, especially a huge cost during construction, to make sure that's accounted for in the construction budget, and that the AO, the SO, all the cybersecurity folks are aware of what's going to be required before this gets turned over. So,
One of the issues we hit is, who makes the decision?
Right. Yes.
Yep. Yes, but who in the system owner has the responsibility to do it?
So I'm not going to let him open that can of worms. But
Yeah, we're not going to go down that like, rabbit hole, but we also as CIO
Yeah.
have a problem with someone saying that they're the system owner.
Right.
Because they're supposed to tell us what's important.
Yep.
So I do agree with that.
Yeah.
And that is an existing problem. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for the
Ma'am,
question.
thank you.
I'm Solveig Keene. I'm from NAFAC Atlantic. And I wanted to bring up a couple more, I guess, best practices or issues that we're having. One of the issues that we're having is when we go through the planning process, there's another project that doesn't really interrelate but touches a little bit, and it's assumed to be done for planning purposes, but by the time we get there, because of equipment delays or whatever, it's significantly delayed. And so I guess a question I have is, how do we look at those aspects of risk for schedule risk and growth in the planning phases when we can still have the money? I mean, I've got a project that was $10 million originally, was the original 1391. We're at 26.2 now, and we just found out that we're going to be delayed at least another 2 years, and we're in construction. And 2 more years of delay is a lot more money. So, I mean, that's kind of an example. It's just one. We have a number of those sorts of things, but how do we look at that risk in the early phases so we don't get it at the end?
So I'm going to go back to our Zutendal example. We actually have a situation where we're counting on another project to build in our sectionalizer so we can reduce that load or shed it. And so as soon as we tried to move to the next stage, we said, hey, pause, time out. Everybody associated with this project, we need to validate the status of that project, the validity that it's moving forward, and the validity that's going to be funded, so we can determine the viability of this project meeting the ERCIP or the critical needs. I don't think there's a good answer for what you ask.
Well, that's fine.
And but you do, I think we all need to just stop and sometimes say, hey, we're all in this together. We're all in this room trying to provide solutions for our warfighter, solutions for our benefits, and let's all get on the same page instead of just worrying about our single project. And honestly, I think teamwork and that type of solution, but there's no good answer.
And the other thing is, if you can get your utility company to lock in what their interconnection requirement is
Yeah.
during planning, because again, we have a project ready to go online, and now they're telling us we have to add a whole bunch of more equipment because their policy has changed in the last 6 months.
That's a good point. And on the interconnection agreement and requirements, a lot of the 1391s that we're seeing have a line item that's maybe $50,000, $100,000. And depending on the utility, depending on the location, depending on the impacts of the microgrid to their system, that may be enough, it may not be enough. Sometimes we're running into issues where the utility says, we need 6 months to do our evaluation. We need the actual equipment purchased, which, as we know, on 1391s, we can't sole source equipment in like special situations. So now, it's a very good point, we're having issues with the utility. And as we mentioned on like the Zutendal, for example, there's an ongoing project with a different project manager than we have, so we're coordinating with them to make sure that we don't know which one's going to be first. They both seem to be funded, and we're coordinating with them, and where we're reviewing their design and they're reviewing our design to make sure that we're coherent. Because as a taxpayer, I don't want to install brand new equipment and then 6 months later tear it out to put new equipment in, because our project is still bound by our 1391 just as theirs is. So we all have our own tunnel vision, but we have to be aware of our adjacent tunnels, if you will.
The only one worse than a large grid supplier to work with is the railroads.
Larry's showing his years of experience. Sir, just hold on real quick. We got 10 more minutes if people have additional questions. We have plenty of time for questions. We have one more, sir.
All right, thanks. Kevin Tates, Power Engineers. You mentioned a lot of the pre-work you had to do to get the utility system figured out. Did you have to do a lot of field data to get that? Was Public Works data available? How did you work with the base to get all that data, SCADA?
I'm going to start with one of the worst documentation situations we're going to be in is electrical systems at federal facilities, because we didn't think that small wires were important at one time in our lives. But with that said, I'm going to let these guys answer.
There is, again, a lot of the bases we're working with, we do not get it from the government. We get it from the privatized utility provider. So that's where we get a distribution. Unfortunately, we had to go and get different software so we could actually use their data to do that. So that is one of the problems, is getting the, like I said, getting the data, getting it from the privatized utility, getting an NDA from the privatized utility so we can get the data. So that's one thing that we didn't mention, but usually one of the first things we do is get a non-disclosure agreement with the privatized utility so we can get the data. And then we do go back and do some validation. It depends how good the data is. We're finding the privatized utilities actually have pretty good data. They're a utility operator. They want to know how the system works. So we can get pretty good data from them.
A lot of these spaces don't have private utilities. Do you just have to go field, collect all of that data on their whole entire network?
So what we encourage the government, as they're planning, to capture and gather as much of that information as they can, get with their energy manager, talk to them about a real conversation where no one's going to be punished about what the level of accuracy is and confidence in the equipment, and then start there. And then a lot of times we will validate what we anticipate those loads to be. Just be aware that for those of you that aren't electrical engineers, to validate a load, you usually want to try and find a long period of time, not just, you can't just say one winter, no summer at all to validate data. So testing takes time if you want to validate, and sometimes we just don't have that amount of time. So not a great answer, but I think we kind of got to where you're at.
And one project, we followed the as-built and we changed some wires and dropped the base. They were wrong.
The as-bills.
The as-built were wrong.
Thank you. I believe we have, I don't know which one of you were first. Okay, thank you.
Hi, Rob McAtee, Mason and Hanger. We're involved in a few microgrid projects as well, and they have utility privatization contractors, which are great to work with generally, but you touched on the conveyance issue. Mm-hmm. And they take a different approach. Some can say, well, that can take 2-3 years. I don't want to touch it until then. I think most of the contracts come through DLA. Is that correct? And if so, or actually, we can skip that part. Is there any consensus kind of coming out of this on how it works? Because it affects a lot more than just cyber as well.
Yeah. And we can have further discussions about this later from what we're seeing. But there is the new NDAA that came out that allows for the Bilcon projects to sole source contract to those privatized utilities. That's thrown a wrench into things with getting into construction and conveyance, and who, you know, if the utility builds it, do they own it? Versus being conveyed to the Army first and then to the utility. That seems to be an ongoing conversation that we're having with some of our customers on our projects. But
Kevin, do you mind if I answer this?
Yeah, go ahead.
For the Army, Huntsville Center is looking at ways to standardize that response based on the NDAA that just came out. NAFAC, I think, is approaching this and looking at this just a little bit differently. Is there a consensus between privatized utilities? No.
John Batchelder, HDR. I had a question about measurement and verification. Is there a BLCC, a basic life cost analysis requirement behind that as well?
Yeah, so we do full LCCA, we do ROIs. We put in some information, you know, from the initial cost, looking at O&M. Some of that is captured with, you know, assuming the privatized utility is going to own it or do that O&M maintenance on it. A lot of times the LCCAs we do and the ROIs, because these are resiliency projects first and mission related first, we're not getting full payback on this equipment. But yeah, that is something we look at because we want to show that these projects, especially with the renewable energy that's being involved, is going to provide payback or at least some benefit back. And you know, putting into that 20, 25, 30 year where you're going to have to replace that equipment as far as like end of life. Is that what you're getting at?
That answers that. But
Yeah.
are there any follow-up, you know, after the turnover of the project on verification that you've actually accomplished what the...
So on a standard Milcon project, Historically, there has not been. I don't think I think that's a good idea. I think what we're seeing is on our energy savings performance contracts, that's a requirement. And I think that we're all familiar with that. But going back and validating that information is, sorry, I'm just pausing and thinking for a moment. It doesn't absolutely get done on a lot of projects. I'm sorry, real quick, for those of you that were trying to follow that, LCCA, life cycle cost analysis, ROI, return on investment.
Hey, Jameson Johnson. I'm acting IM at Naval Base Guam. So one of the biggest issues we have with ERCIP is that they pick up so few every year, and the criteria changes annually. And it's getting more and more away from actually working towards resiliency and moving more towards just accomplishing green energy goals. And what we find ourselves in is kind of this loop of every year we're reworking the DD1391s either to change the scope so that it matches the criteria a little bit better, or to broaden it so that we pick up additional buildings. And we get into this issue where we're tracking 10 ERCIPs at this point, 10 DD1391s, and we're losing track of the scope and actually kind of missing our estimates. Do you have any sort of experience with that process? And I guess, is there any sort of advice we could get for that, towards meeting that?
So, sir, the first thing I will say is, yes, you're accurate. Money competes with money for projects, and that's why you keep getting updated requirements, because they're trying to make sure they meet the current needs as they go. Larry, I'm going to let you kind of add to the planning phases that go into the early planning of a DD1391.
No, we've done some of these things for the Navy. I know we worked with Deloitte on this type of thing. The problem you're getting to is getting to a point where somebody puts a stake in the ground and says they're done. And that's one of the problems you're seeing. You never get a stake on that ground. The other thing is that this is, I don't know how you solve it.
Well, I'm going to suggest, sir, that you first focus on your FY year ones, the ones that are coming very recent, because those are the ones that are going to have to compete. And those are the ones that I would focus on if I were you, the FY 26, 27s. I don't think we have better advice than that. I'd be interested if anyone in the audience has a better answer to that.
The point to that was that it seems like you're doing great work, but it seems like it's a huge investment, and it takes a lot of time. And
Yeah.
if we're having to revalidate annually, it kind of is like, okay, well, that was, we spent that money, now we have to respend it, right?
Yeah.
And so how do we get to a point where it's not a total loss, I guess?
Yeah.
And maybe there's not a good answer.
I believe that I have a person who wants to try and respond to you from the back. You come to the mic, please.
So one of the things, Raul Herrera with Black and Beach, one of the things that we're seeing consistently across all DD1391 scopes is the fact that the intent of the mission is not well described. And that is really where some things get lost in translation. So I had a recent conversation where we were talking about the fact that the planning charrette goes through stages. So sometimes an A&E will grab it and provide its 2 cents into the PCR, and then there's a PCR validation process where another AE grabs it and then provides their 2 cents and questions the AE before, because as engineers, we validate each other, right? Then after that, it gets bid, it gets awarded, and then let's say we grab it, and then we're trying to figure out exactly what that is. So overall, it gets lost in translation a bit, and I think it's important that, and one of the biggest questions that we ask at the very beginning is, what exactly are you trying to do? Because there's all these requirements of provide these 2 generators, provide these BESS, provide this equipment, provide that equipment. And the fact is that nobody really knows, because now it's also, other folks managing the project as well, on behalf of USACE or on behalf of, the government. So we have to always go back to what is the intent. So if we understand what the intent is, then we can manage, control, build, execute the actual project to that specification, because it does happen that time after time it gets lost in translation. So I think that's the best. So going back to every project that every AE starts, we have to go back to that same question. That's the best that I have.
Thank you, Raul. I appreciate that response. I'm going to say to everyone, thank you. You guys have been a great audience. We've reached the time limit for this. If you have additional questions, we're available to answer those. Again, thank you. Appreciate it.